They thought I was just a quiet farmer who wouldn't fight back. The HOA believed they could take advantage of me, a man who had spent his whole life tending to the soil and raising cattle on land that had been in my family for generations. But one morning, I woke up to find that my 3,200 acres of farmland, the very ground where my grandfather had built his first barn, had been sold off without my knowledge. The papers showed the HOA had legally transferred my property to a developer, and every home in their fancy neighborhood now stood on stolen soil. They laughed when I demanded answers, saying I was powerless. What they didn't know was that I had the law on my side and a plan sharp enough to cut through their arrogance. In the end, they would lose everything, and I would watch justice fall like a hammer. The morning it all began was quiet, almost deceptively peaceful. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, spilling golden light across my fields. I remember standing on my porch with a cup of coffee in hand, listening to the roosters call and the wind rustle through the tall grass. That land, 200 acres of open soil, woods, and grazing pastures, was more than just property to me. It was blood, sweat, and family history stitched into the earth itself. My grandfather had cleared part of it with his bare hands. My father had built barns and fences on it, and I had spent my whole life working it, planting crops, raising cattle, and keeping the family name tied to the soil. To me, it wasn't land, it was legacy. I had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. It was supposed to be a normal day. I planned to haul feed out to the cattle and maybe check the fences on the southern side of the property. Instead, I drove into town that morning to renew my agricultural permits. A routine trip, one I had made dozens of times before. I parked outside the county office, nodded at a few familiar faces, and carried my paperwork inside. The clerk at the counter, a woman named Denise who had always been polite to me, gave me a strange look when I slid the forms over. She tapped on her keyboard, frowned, then excused herself to go check something in the back. When she returned, she carried a thin folder and looked uneasy. "Sir," she said carefully, "I don't have records of this property listed under your name anymore." For a second, I thought I misheard her. I gave a short laugh and shook my head. "That can't be right. I've been farming that land since before you started working here." She didn't laugh. Instead, she opened the folder and showed me documents I had never seen before, papers that declared my farmland, every acre of it, was no longer mine. The records listed a transfer of ownership to the homeowners association in the neighboring subdivision. The ink on the signatures looked clean and official, stamped and sealed like it had all been properly processed. My stomach twisted and I felt my pulse in my ears. "This is a mistake," I told her. "It has to be. Someone messed up the filing. My land doesn't belong to any damn HOA." Denise looked almost apologetic, but she only said, "You'll need to take this up with the county recorder or legal counsel. As of right now, these documents are what we have on file." I walked out of that office in a daze. The folder felt heavy in my hands, like a stone pressing down on my chest. My land, my family's land. Sold, transferred, stolen right from under me. How was that even possible? By the time I reached my truck, my hands were trembling with anger. I didn't drive home. Instead, I turned the wheel toward the subdivision, the place where the HOA had been growing more arrogant every year. They had built their little kingdom on the edge of my farmland, all shiny new houses with perfectly trimmed lawns, fences, painted the same color, and rules about everything from mailbox height to the color of curtains. They'd always acted like they owned more than they did. They cut across my fields without asking, complained about the smell of cattle, and once even suggested I sell my land so they could expand the community. I had laughed them off at the time, not realizing they would try to take it anyway. When I pulled into their office parking lot, I didn't bother to calm myself. I stormed inside, clutching the folder in my hand like a weapon. Behind the desk sat Karen, the HOA president. She was exactly the kind of woman you'd expect to be running that show. Expensive clothes, smug expression, and a way of talking that made everything sound like an insult. She looked up and raised her eyebrows as if I was already wasting her time. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone sharp. I slapped the documents down on her desk. "You can start by explaining this. These papers say you people own my farmland. Care to tell me how in hell that happened?" Her lips curled into a smile that made my blood boil. She leaned back in her chair and folded her hands neatly on her lap. "Oh, that," she said, as if we were talking about the weather. "Yes, the land transfer. We've been working with the county for some time now. Honestly, it's for the best. That much land just sitting out there underutilized, it's practically begging for development. Don't take it personally, it's business." "Business," I snapped. "That's my family's home, my cattle, my livelihood. You had no right to touch it." Karen tilted her head, still smiling. "You're one man. We represent a community. Progress is inevitable. You can't stop it." Her words hit me like a punch. She wasn't even denying it. She was gloating, right to my face. My fists clenched so tight my knuckles turned white. And for a moment I had to fight the urge to throw something through her window. Instead, I leaned forward and said through gritted teeth, "You stole from me, and I'm going to make damn sure every person involved pays for it." She laughed, actually laughed. "Good luck with that." she said, waving her manicured hand, as if dismissing me like a child. The land is already spoken for. Go back to your little farm. I walked out of that office shaking with rage. The sun that had looked so warm and peaceful that morning now felt like fire on my skin. My mind spun with questions. How had they pulled this off? Who signed off on it? Why hadn't I been notified? When I got home, I pulled out every deed, every tax receipt, every scrap of paper I had that tied me to that land. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't some small mistake, it was a scheme. The HOA had power, money, and connections. They had probably bribed someone in the county, forged signatures, and manipulated the system to push the transfer through. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with papers spread out all around me, the smell of stale coffee in the air, my hands scribbling notes and questions. I thought about my grandfather who had worked until his hands bled to clear the first fields. I thought about my father who built the barns and taught me how to plant corn in neat, straight lines. And I thought about how easily it could all be erased if I didn't fight. By dawn, I had made a decision. They wanted a fight, they were going to get one. I wasn't just going to take back what they stole. I was going to make sure the HOA never forgot what happened when they crossed the wrong man. The morning after I discovered the theft, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest that I couldn't shake. My mind replayed the scene in the HOA office again and again. Corinne's smug smile, her arrogant tone, the way she dismissed me like was nothing more than a stubborn old farmer standing in the way of progress. I'd never felt such a mix of anger and helplessness in my life, but I wasn't going to sit and stew in it. If there was one thing generations of farming had taught me, it was patience, persistence, and the ability to outlast anyone who tried to break me. I started with the county recorder's office. If the HOA had managed to transfer my land, there had to be paperwork, real paperwork, not just the copies Denise had shown me. When I walked in, the clerk behind the counter looked up and recognized me right away. "Morning," he said with a smile. "What brings you here?" "I need the complete file on property transfers for the last 6 months. I told him, specifically anything involving parcel numbers 1120 through 1456. That was the section covering all 3,200 acres of my farmland. The clerk gave me a curious look, but didn't argue. He disappeared into the back and returned with a thick stack of documents. My hands tightened as he slid the stack across the counter. I carried it over to a table, sat down, and began flipping through. It didn't take long before I saw the problem. The transfer papers bore my name but not my signature. The handwriting was close enough to fool a casual glance, but I knew my own scrawl. This was neater, smoother, almost as if it had been carefully traced. Someone had forged my signature. They even had a notary stamp, but the notary's name was one I didn't recognize. I flipped page after page, feeling my blood pressure climb. They hadn't just stolen it, they had done it with confidence, layering the fraud with fake signatures, bogus authorizations, and even fabricated meeting minutes claiming I had agreed to sell the land. At the back of the file, one detail caught my eye. The HOA's lawyer had filed all the transfer paperwork. His name was stamped at the bottom of every page. Clifford Wainwright, attorney at law. I leaned back in my chair staring at that name. Clifford had been around town for years, a slick man with a silver tongue. He was known for representing developers and big money. The type who thought farmland was nothing more than empty space waiting to be turned into subdivisions. It made sense. If anyone could weave this web of lies, it would be him, I gathered. The copies stuffed them into my bag and left the recorder's office with my jaw set. My next stop was the sheriff's department. Sheriff Dalton had been a friend of my father's, and while I didn't like asking for favors, this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about corruption. Dalton listened carefully as I laid the documents on his desk. His eyes narrowed as he studied the forged signature. "That's not yours," he said flatly. "Not even close." I replied. He flipped through more pages, his frown deepening. "This smells dirty, but I can't act on just suspicion. If you want this pursued, you'll need to take it to court. Fraud on this level, it's big. Bigger than just my office." I expected as much. "So what do?" I asked. Dalton tapped his finger on the folder. "Get yourself a lawyer who isn't afraid of Wainwright. File a civil suit. Meanwhile, I'll quietly start poking around. If there's criminal activity here, and I'd bet my badge there is, I'll find it." I nodded. It wasn't the immediate justice I wanted, but it was a start. That night, I sat at my kitchen table again, the papers spread out like a battlefield map. The anger was still there, but now it had direction. I started making a list of everything. I needed a lawyer, witnesses, every piece of evidence I could dig up that proved the land was mine and had always been mine. The next morning, I called up James Holloway, an old friend of my father's who had become one of the most respected property lawyers in the state. James was semi-retired now, living quietly on a ranch 2 towns over. But when I explained what had happened, his voice hardened. "Send me everything you've got," he said. "This isn't just theft, this is organized fraud. If the HOA is behind this, they're playing with fire." Within a week, James drove out to my farm and sat at my table with stacks of law books and notes. He spent hours reviewing every page of the fraudulent transfer documents, muttering under his breath as he traced the forged signatures and notary stamps. Finally, he looked up at me. "They didn't just cross the line," he said. "They obliterated it. Forgery, fraud, conspiracy, you name it. But the key is this. If the land was transferred illegally, then every development, every house, every yard in that subdivision is sitting on stolen property. That means the homeowners are caught in the middle too." The thought gave me pause. The families, they didn't know. No, they didn't, James agreed. But the HOA acted as if it had the authority to sell, and now, legally, those houses rest on quicksand. If we win, you don't just get your land back, you could technically claim every house they've built on it. That hit me like a bolt of lightning. The power of it, the scale of what was at stake, it was bigger than I had even imagined. We filed the lawsuit the following week. The moment the papers were served, panic rippled through the HOA board. Karen called me personally, her voice sharp and venomous. "You think you can scare us with a lawsuit?" she snapped. "No," I said calmly. "I don't want to scare you. I want to destroy every bit of this scheme you pulled. And I will." She spat something about countersuits and ruining myself financially, but I hung up before she could finish. I wasn't interested in her threats. As word spread, the homeowners in the subdivision started asking questions. Some came knocking on my door, confused and frightened. "Is it true?" one man asked, clutching the lawsuit notice in his hand, "that the land our homes are on isn't really ours?" I didn't sugarcoat it. "It's true. The HOA stole it. You're as much victims as I am." The fear in their eyes told me the board was losing its grip. Meanwhile, James and I dug deeper. We tracked down the notary whose stamp appeared on the documents. She swore she had never notarized anything for me or the HOA, and when we compared her official logs to the papers filed with the county, the entries didn't match. More fraud, more evidence. We also found a county zoning board member willing to talk off the record at first. He admitted he'd been pressured by Wainwright and the HOA to approve the transfer, with promises of kickbacks for development approvals. Once James promised him protection, he agreed to testify. Every piece of evidence made the case stronger. Every lie we uncovered made the HOA weaker. But the battle had only begun, and I knew Chapter 2 of this fight was going to be bloodier than the first. One night, as I locked up the barn, I stood at the edge of my fields, looking out at the faint glow of streetlights from the subdivision. In the distance, those houses stood on my soil. That glow came from land my family had bled for, and I swore, under that night sky, that no matter how long it took, I would tear down everything they had built on stolen ground. Because this wasn't just about acres of land. This was about respect, legacy, and justice, and I was just getting started. The first court date felt like stepping into a battlefield. I wasn't a man who liked suits or polished shoes, but that morning I wore both. James Holloway stood beside me, calm and confident, his silver hair slicked back and his eyes sharp with determination. He had the look of a man who had been through countless wars and courtrooms and had no intention of losing this one. The courthouse was buzzing with people. Homeowners from the subdivision packed the benches, whispering nervously among themselves. Some looked at me with sympathy, others with suspicion. They were caught in the middle, unsure if I was their enemy or the only man who could save them from losing everything. On the other side of the aisle, Karen and her HOA board sat stiff and arrogant, with their lawyer, Clifford Wainwright, leading the charge. Clifford looked exactly as I remembered, a polished suit, a smug smile, and the kind of eyes that never showed an ounce of guilt. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. This was at the beginning of a fight that would decide the fate of my land and every house that sat on it. James started strong, laying out the facts: forged signatures, falsified notary stamps, and the suspiciously fast approval of the land transfer. He spoke clearly and calmly, presenting each document like a nail in the coffin. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "my client's land was stolen from him under fraudulent circumstances. This wasn't a mistake. This was a calculated scheme." Clifford stood and delivered his rebuttal with that oily confidence he was known for. He painted me as an outdated farmer, clinging to land he wasn't properly utilizing. He claimed the transfer was legal and beneficial for the community. "Progress cannot be halted by stubbornness," he said smoothly. "This was a transaction that benefited hundreds of families." I wanted to stand up and shout, but James placed a steady hand on my arm, keeping me calm. He knew we had the stronger case, we just had to let the evidence speak. The first witness was the notary, whose stamp had appeared on the documents. She took the stand, nervous but resolute, under oath. She testified that she had never notarized anything for me or the HOA. When James presented her official logbook, it showed no record of the supposed signatures. Clifford tried to shake her, suggesting maybe she forgot or misplaced the record, but she didn't budge. "I take my work seriously," she said firmly. "If it's not in my log, I didn't do it. Someone forged my stamp." That was the first crack in the HOA's wall. Next came the zoning board member. He looked uncomfortable as he sat down, but when asked if he had been pressured by Clifford and Karen to approve the land transfer, he nodded. "Yes," he admitted. "They implied there would be financial rewards if I expedited the process. I regret my part in it." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The homeowners began to murmur, some shooting angry looks at Karen. Karen, for her part, sat rigid in her seat, her face pale but her jaw tight with defiance. Clifford leaned over and whispered something to her, but she didn't respond. By the time court adjourned for the day, the mood had shifted. What began as a case that many thought was hopeless now looked like a real fight. Reporters gathered outside, shoving microphones toward me as I walked out. "How do you feel about your chances?" one asked. I paused, looked straight into the camera, and said, "This land has been in my family for generations. They stole it with lies, and I'll fight until it's back where it belongs." The clip made the evening news, and by the next morning, the whole town was talking. Some praised me as a fighter for justice. Others whispered that I was going to bankrupt the homeowners if I won. But I didn't let it get to me. I knew the truth, and the truth was my strongest weapon. Second week of hearings dug even deeper. James presented financial records, showing suspicious transfers from the HOA's account to county officials during the same time the land transfer was approved. The amounts weren't small. They were large enough to scream bribery. Clifford objected, at every turn, his voice growing sharper and more desperate. But the judge overruled him again and again. Then came the moment that broke their arrogance. James revealed aerial photographs and land surveys that proved I was actively using my farmland. Crops, cattle, fencing, all of it, clearly maintained. The HOA had argued I abandoned the property, but the photos told the truth. Clifford's smooth words couldn't twist what everyone saw with their own eyes. When Karen was finally called to the stand, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost she tried to hold herself together. But James was relentless. He asked simple, direct questions she couldn't dodge. "Did you personally notify Mr. Walker of the land transfer before it was filed?" Her lips tightened. "No." "Did you ever receive his written consent to transfer ownership of 3,200 acres?" She shifted in her seat. "No." "So you moved forward with the process without the rightful owner's knowledge or consent. Is that correct?" The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Finally, she muttered, "Yes." That one word was like a hammer falling. By the end of the third week, it was clear the HOA's case was collapsing. The homeowners began showing up in larger numbers, many glaring at their own board members. Some approached me outside the courthouse, apologizing for what had happened and begging me not to take it out on them. I listened politely, but I didn't make promises. This wasn't about revenge against Temet, it was about justice against the thieves who put them in this position. Still, it wasn't easy. At night, when I sat on my porch looking out over the fields, I thought about those families, kids playing in backyards, people paying mortgages on houses they might lose if the court ruled entirely in my favor. It wasn't their fault, but I also couldn't ignore what was stolen from me. I knew that if I didn't fight to the end, they'd walk all over me and, probably over someone else next. The final hearing of that round was the most powerful. James gave a closing statement that echoed in the courtroom. He held up the original deed to my land, the one passed down from my grandfather, and said, "This isn't just paper. This is legacy, stolen by arrogance and greed. If this court allows fraud to stand, then no property owner in this state is safe. Justice demands this land be returned to its rightful owner." The judge didn't give a ruling that day, but I saw it in his eyes. He knew the truth. The evidence was too strong to ignore. That night I drove out to the far edge of my property line where the subdivision lights glowed against the dark sky. I stood there for a long time, the cool wind brushing against my face. Those houses stood on stolen ground, and everyone inside them knew it now. Karen and her board had built their empire on lies, and I was tearing it down brick by brick. And though the battle was far from over, for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something I hadn't in weeks: hope. The courthouse was packed tighter than ever on the morning of the final ruling. Word had spread through town like wildfire, and even people who had no stake in the subdivision showed up just to see how it would all end. Farmers, business owners, and townsfolk filled the benches, whispering to one another about corruption, fraud, and stolen land. The air was heavy with anticipation, the kind that makes every coffin shuffle sound louder than it should. I sat near the front beside James, my lawyer, staring at the polished wood of the judge's bench. My heart thumped like a hammer in my chest, but my face stayed still. I'd been through storms before, and I knew better than to let anyone see fear. Across the aisle, Karen and her board sat pale-faced, their once arrogant expressions replaced with tight jaws and darting eyes. Clifford, their lawyer, still wore his polished suit and smug smile, but even he looked different now, like a man pretending confidence while the ground caved beneath him. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Everyone rose, then sat as he cleared his throat and began speaking. "This court has reviewed all evidence presented in the matter of Walker versus Crestwood Homeowners Association. After careful consideration, the court finds." The pause that followed was unbearable. I felt every muscle in my body tighten. That the transfer of 3,200 acres of farmland from the Walker family to the Crestwood Homeowners Association was fraudulent, unlawful, and void. The words hit me like a thunderclap, but in the best way imaginable. Relief surged through me so hard my hands trembled against the table. A ripple of gasps and whispers filled the courtroom, the sound of disbelief and shock. The judge raised his hand for silence before continuing. Evidence has shown forgery, falsification of notary stamps, and bribery of public officials. Therefore, all property rights revert immediately to the rightful owner, Mr. Samuel Walker. Furthermore, this court finds the Crestwood HOA and its board members liable for damages, including financial compensation for losses incurred by Mr. Walker. Karen's face went white. Clifford shifted uncomfortably, his smug mask slipping for the first time. But the judge wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his voice firm and deliberate. Additionally, because the subdivision homes were built and sold on land obtained through fraud, Mr. Walker is granted the legal authority to pursue remedies, including reclamation of the land and liquidation of properties built upon it. The responsibility for this situation lies squarely with the HOA board. The homeowners themselves may seek restitution from those who misled them, but this court cannot and will not deny Mr. Walker his rightful ownership. The room erupted. Homeowners shouted, some in outrage, others in panic. Reporters scribbled furiously. Karen turned on Clifford, her voice rising above the chaos. You told me this would work. You said we were safe. Clifford muttered something back, but his face was red, and the sweat on his forehead betrayed him. James leaned toward me and whispered, we won. Sam, we didn't just win, we crushed them. For a moment, I couldn't move. The relief was overwhelming. My land, my family's land, was mine again. Justice had spoken louder than any threat or lie the HOA could muster. But as I looked around at the sea of faces, I saw the other side of victory. Families sat in tears, clutching each other, terrified of losing the homes they had poured their lives into. Kids sat confused, too young to understand why their parents were so shaken. When the judge dismissed the court, the crowd spilled into the hallway. Reporters swarmed me, microphones thrust in my face. Mr. Walker, will you sell the subdivision homes? What will happen to the families living there? Do you intend to evict them? I didn't answer right away. I looked straight into one of the cameras and said, only justice was served today. That's all I'll say for now. Then I pushed past them and walked outside into the blinding sunlight. Karen wasn't far behind me. She caught up, her heels clicking against the concrete. You can't do this, she hissed. You may have won today, but if you sell those homes, you'll be hated. No one will ever see you as the victim again. I turned to her slowly, meeting her furious eyes with calm steel. You stole my land, Karen. You tried to erase my family's legacy for profit. Don't lecture me about consequences. You brought this on yourself. She opened her mouth to snap back, but Clifford tugged her arm and muttered something about leaving before she made things worse. For once, she didn't argue. She turned on her heel and stormed off, her board members trailing behind like beaten dogs. That night I sat on my porch and looked out across the dark fields, the sound of crickets filling the air. That land felt different now, not just mine, but defended, reclaimed. I had fought for it, bled for it, and won, but I also knew the fight wasn't truly over. The court had given me the authority to liquidate the homes, and whether I acted on it or not, the power alone was enough to shake the entire subdivision to its core. Over the next few days, the town buzzed with gossip. Some people praised me as a hero who had stood up to corruption. Others called me ruthless, wondering if I would actually sell off the houses. Homeowners from Crestwood showed up at my gate, some begging for mercy, others threatening lawsuits of their own. James advised me to stay quiet and let the dust settle. Don't make any promises yet, he said. Right now, they need to sit with the weight of what their board did. Meanwhile, the state opened investigations into Clifford and the county, officials who had taken bribes. Arrests were made within weeks. Headlines blared across the newspapers. HOA corruption exposed in Crestwood scandal. Clifford tried to spin it, claiming he had no knowledge of the forgery, but no one bought it. Karen and several board members were indicted on fraud charges. The empire they built on arrogance was crumbling faster than they could hold it together. I went back to farming. The cattle didn't care about lawsuits and the crops didn't wait for verdicts. Every morning I saddled up and rode the fence lines, feeling the satisfaction of knowing the ground under my boots was truly mine again. Yet each time I passed near the subdivision, I saw the rows of houses and thought about the choices ahead of me. The law gave me the right to sell them, to make every last homeowner pack up and leave, to reclaim every inch of soil. But it wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about what came next. Would I show mercy to the families who had been misled? Or would I let the hammer fall, teaching the entire state that no one steals from a farmer without paying the price? The weight of that decision settled on me like the setting sun. One thing was certain, the HOA thought they could bury me under paperwork and arrogance. Instead, they had buried themselves. And soon, I would decide just how deep that hole went. The courthouse was buzzing with an energy I had never experienced before. Weeks of hearings, endless documents, and sharp exchanges had built to this final moment. The gallery was filled with anxious homeowners, local reporters, and curious residents who had come to see whether a single farmer could truly bring down an entire HOA board. I sat at the front with my lawyer, papers stacked high beside us, while across the aisle Karen and her board members whispered furiously among themselves. The arrogance they had carried at the start was gone now, replaced by pale faces and tight jaws. They knew the evidence had buried them, and all they had left was hope for a miracle. When the judge entered, silence swept the room. His robe dragged the floor as he adjusted his glasses and scanned the room, his face unreadable. He shuffled through the stack of evidence, flipping over documents my lawyer and I had fought tooth and nail to collect. Forged deeds, fake signatures, falsified minutes from HOA meetings. It was all there, every piece of the puzzle laid bare. Karen's lawyers tried one last desperate move, insisting it was a misunderstanding, a clerical error, a community decision made with the best of intentions. The judge cut them off. "I have reviewed every shred of evidence," he said, his voice echoing across the silent chamber. "This court finds the HOA board guilty of fraudulent transfer of property, intentional misrepresentation, and conspiracy to defraud. The farmland in question, comprising 3,200 acres, is hereby restored to its rightful owner." For a second, the weight of the words didn't hit me. Then it did. My land, the soil my father had plowed, the fields where I had spent countless hours under the burning sun, was mine again. Relief flooded me so strongly I felt my hand shake. My lawyer patted my shoulder, whispering, "We won, John, we really won." But the judge wasn't finished. He paused, then continued in a tone that carried the sharp edge of justice. "Furthermore, due to the illegal sale and development of this farmland, all properties constructed on this land are deemed conveyed. Ownership reverts to the plaintiff, who has full legal authority to liquidate or repossess these properties to recover damages." Gasps filled the room. Homeowners turned on the board, shouting and cursing. Karen stood up, red-faced, slamming her hands on the table. "This is insane," she screamed. "You can't just give them the right to take people's homes." The judge leaned forward, eyes like steel. "The board's reckless and fraudulent actions put every homeowner in this position. Actions have consequences. This court will not shield criminals from accountability. Sit down, Ms. Matthews, or I will have you removed." Karen collapsed back into her chair, trembling with fury, while I sat frozen. The full scope of what the judge had just granted me rolled over in waves. Not only was my land restored, but every house built on it was legally mine to reclaim or sell. For the first time since this nightmare began, the balance had tipped in my favor so far that the very people who mocked me were now powerless tenants on my soil. After the hearing ended, chaos erupted outside. Homeowners crowded around, some begging for mercy, others shouting at Karen and her board for destroying their lives. Reporters shoved microphones at me, asking what I planned to do now that I owned dozens of homes in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the county. I gave no answer. Not yet. I needed to think. I needed to let the weight of it settle before deciding the fate of the people who had lived comfortably while I fought to keep my legacy. Over the next few weeks, I met with my lawyer and financial advisors, carefully mapping out the path ahead. Legally, I had every right to liquidate the properties. Each sale would help me recover damages, cover legal fees, and secure my family's land for generations to come. Emotionally, though, I wrestled with the thought of uprooting families who had bought their homes in good faith, unaware of the HOA's fraud. But whenever doubt crept in, I remembered Karen's smirk the day she told me I was powerless, the way she said my land was better off in their hands. That memory steeled my resolve. I hadn't started this war, but I was damn sure going to finish it. Notices went out within a month. Homeowners were informed that their properties had been repossessed and would be auctioned off. Panic spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Some tried to rally, forming committees to appeal the court's ruling, but every lawyer they spoke to said the same thing. There was nothing they could do. Their fate had been sealed the moment their board broke the law. The first auction was surreal. Rows of bidders filled the county building, eager to snatch up prime houses at reduced rates. Karen stormed in with her usual bravado, but she couldn't mask the desperation in her eyes. "You'll regret this." She spat at me across the room. "You'll never stop us." But her words had lost their sting. I simply looked at her and said, "You already stopped yourselves." One by one, the homes sold. Families packed moving trucks, their lives uprooted in the same way mine had nearly been destroyed. The irony was bitter but undeniable. They were losing their homes on stolen land, while I was reclaiming everything they thought I would never see again. By the third auction, Karen's own home came up for sale. I stood at the back of the room, watching her squirm as the bidding began. She tried to protest, shouting that it was unfair, that she had built her life there. No one listened. The gavel came down, and her house, her symbol of control, was gone. Watching her walk away with tears of rage felt like the final nail in the coffin. Months passed, and by the time the last home was sold, the once proud neighborhood stood empty, a ghost of its former self. The manicured lawns grew wild, the streets silent except for the occasional passing car. I drove through one last time, stopping to look at the rows of abandoned houses. It struck me then how quickly arrogance can crumble when faced with truth. What they thought was untouchable had vanished, like dust in the wind. With the proceeds from the sales, I paid off debts, secured my land, and even invested in expanding my farm. For the first time in years, I felt peace settle over me like the setting sun. My grandfather's legacy was intact, my family's name cleared, and the land I loved was mine again. Karen and her board didn't fare so well. Most of them faced criminal charges, fines, and in Karen's case, jail time for fraud and conspiracy. The same woman who had once strutted around as queen of the HOA now sat behind bars, stripped of everything. Justice had a way of balancing the scales, and this time it had come down like a hammer. One quiet evening, I walked out to the edge of my fields, the horizon painted in shades of gold and crimson. I breathed in the scent of fresh earth, felt the soil beneath my boots, and let the silence wrap around me. The land was mine, not just in paperwork, but in spirit. It had survived theft, greed, and corruption, just as I had. I knew then that this chapter was over. The fight was done, the land restored, and the people who thought they could steal from a farmer had learned the hardest lesson of all. You can't take roots out of the earth without consequences. Justice wasn't just served, it was planted deep, and it would grow for generations. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Bright Reality for more powerful real-life tales. Stay tuned for more shocking stories you won't forget only on Bright Reality.